"There is a ribbon," said the Duke of Inchwood, "tied to the banister of my staircase." He had been in his own hall for 11 seconds. He had not yet given up his gloves. "Yes, Your Grace," said Mrs. Merridew, who had been his nurse 30 years ago and had never once in that time been frightened of him, which he privately considered the great failure of his life. "There are 7. It is a game, a game. They are counting them, Your Grace. Whoever finds the last one before the clock strikes has the first of the ginger cake." Rafe Arden, 6th Duke of Inchwood, stood in the middle of a hall he had left in November and did not recognize in May. There was a fire in it. There had never been a fire in the great hall at Inchwood. His father had held that it was waste, and Rafe, who had inherited his father's arithmetic along with his father's chin, had never questioned it. There were flowers, cow parsley and bluebells, in a copper jug that he was almost certain belonged in the dairy. There was a smell of baking that had reached him in the sweep, before the door was even open. Somewhere above on the landing, somebody was laughing in a way that no one had laughed in that house since his brother died, and there was a length of blue ribbon knotted round the newel post, where his grandfather's hand had rested for 40 years. "Mrs. Merridew," he said, "where is my household? About the place, Your Grace. Where is my steward? Turned off in January, Your Grace." Rafe turned his head slowly and looked at her. "Turned off," he repeated. "By whom?" And Mrs. Merridew, 62 years old, 4 feet 11 inches, with her hands folded in front of her apron, looked back at him with an expression of the most perfect and impenetrable innocence and said, "By her Grace, Your Grace. Or by the lady who will be her Grace, if you have not changed your mind, which I am sure you have not, being a gentleman." He had forgotten her. That was the shameful truth, and he faced it standing in the hall in his travelling coat, with the wet spring wind coming in behind him. He had not forgotten the arrangement. A man does not forget that he is contracted to marry. But he had put the woman herself somewhere at the back of a very crowded mind, in the drawer where he kept the things that could be dealt with later, beside his brother's debts and the Vienna business, and the letters from his cousin Ormerod that he had stopped opening. The engagement had been the work of his grandmother, who had been dead 9 months and who had, in the way of formidable old women, arranged a very great deal of the world before departing it. She had written to him in her last month, in a hand like a dropped fence, "I have found her. Cordelia Marsh, my goddaughter, the daughter of the man who pulled your father out of the river at Cordon and drowned doing it, and who left her nothing but debts and a great deal of character. She has no money, no connections, and no beauty to speak of, so she will not be spoiled by the world before you have the wit to see her. You will not like her at first. You are too like your father. She will come to you at Inchwood in the spring, and you will marry her in the summer, and one day you will understand that I have done you the greatest kindness of your life. Do not argue with me. I am dying, and it is a shocking advantage in a negotiation." He had signed the settlements out of grief and a certain dark amusement, and had thought, in the private honesty of a man who does not intend to be honest aloud, that there would be time to undo it. And then the Vienna business had gone wrong, and his brother's creditors had come out of the ground like wasps, and he had gone abroad in November for 6 weeks, and had stayed 7 months. She had arrived in March. He knew that, because Miss Merridew had written to tell him so, and because he had put the letter in his pocket unopened in an inn at Ostend, and had found it 4 months later, and had not opened it then either. "Where is she?" he said. "In the old schoolroom, Your Grace, with the little ones." "It is Tuesday." "What has Tuesday to do with it?" Mrs. Merridew looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite pity. "Tuesday is Latin," she said. He went up. He went up quietly, which was not entirely honourable, and he told himself as he went that a man is entitled to see his own house as it truly is, and knew perfectly well that he was afraid. The schoolroom door stood open 2 inches. Rafe stopped in the passage with his hand not quite touching the wood. His brother's 2, Hetty, who had been 6 when her parents went into the sea off the fold, and Tom, who had been 3, and whom Rafe had inherited along with the debts and the title and had handled, in 4 years, with the tenderness of a man handling glass in the dark, were sitting at the old deal table with their heads together over a slate, and on the table, with her sleeves turned back and a smudge of chalk along her jaw, sat a young woman, not at the table, on it, cross-legged like a tailor, with her skirts tucked round her ankles and her boots showing plain, mended boots, one of them patched at the toe, and she was pointing with a piece of chalk at something on the slate and saying, in a voice of high theatrical outrage, "And so Hannibal says, 'Very well then, if you will not let me over the mountains, I shall simply go over the mountains,' which is not an argument, it is a temper, and he took 37 elephants over the Alps entirely out of spite, and I am told several of them enjoyed it." Tom shrieked with laughter. Hetty, who was 10 now and had not, to Rafe's certain knowledge, laughed aloud in his presence since the funeral, said, with enormous dignity, "That is not what it says in the book." "It is not," the young woman agreed, "and the book is dull and Hannibal was not, and one day you will read a great many books, and you will find that the dullness is nearly always the author's fault and hardly ever the Carthaginians." "Cordelia," said Tom, "may we do the elephants?" "We may do the elephants when you have given me the ablative." Rafe Arden stood in the passage of his own house and could not move. She was not beautiful. His grandmother had been quite right and quite wrong, and the wrongness of it went through him like a hand closing round his throat. She had a plain, tired, mobile face, and untidy brown hair coming down at one side and chalk on her jaw, and he searched for the word for a long moment and found it, and it appalled him. She was a light. His house was warm. His hall had flowers in it. His brother's boy was laughing. And he had been in Vienna for 7 months and had not written once. Hetty saw him first. The laughter went out of her face like a snuffed candle, and she stood up, and Tom stood up because Hetty had, and the young woman on the table turned her head. She did not shriek. She did not fall off the table, which he would have understood. She looked at the tall, travel-stained, unshaven man in the doorway for perhaps a second and a half, and then she unfolded herself from the table with the greatest possible calm, and shook out her skirts and said, "You will be the Duke." "I will," said Rafe. "You are 2 months late," said Cordelia Marsh, "and you have not written, and Hetty has asked me every Tuesday since the thaw whether you are dead, and I have told her every Tuesday that you are not, on the grounds that we should certainly have been informed, which is a poor sort of comfort to give a person, and I have had to give it 11 times. Nobody in the history of the Dukedom of Inchwood had ever spoken to its holder in that tone." The 2 children stood absolutely still, watching the way people watch a fire in a neighbouring street. Rafe found that his voice was not entirely under his command. "Miss Marsh," he said, "you are sitting on the table. I was sitting on the table. I am now standing on the floor, Your Grace, in a manner that would satisfy an archbishop, and I would remind you that I was sitting on it in order to teach your nephew the ablative case, and he has learned it, which nobody managed in 4 years of doing it properly." "Cordelia," said Hetty, very small, "he has come home." And Rafe watched the young woman's face change, watched the fight go out of it as though a door had shut, and she turned and knelt down in front of the girl, there on the schoolroom boards, and took both of her hands. "He has," she said. I told you he would. You said Tuesday." "I have never in my life been right about a day," said Cordelia Marsh, "and I am not going to begin now merely because it would be convenient." Hetty laughed. It was a wet, cracked, dreadful little laugh, and it was the best sound the Duke of Inchwood had heard in 4 years, and he had to look away from it, at the window at nothing at all. When he looked back, Cordelia was on her feet with her chin up and her hands behind her, and there was chalk on her jaw and a patch on her boot, and she looked at him steadily, without one atom of fear, and he understood, with the cold, exact, unwelcome clarity of a man reading a balance sheet he has been avoiding for months, that she was not standing like that because she was brave. She was standing like that because she expected to be sent away. He had the accounts brought to the library that night, and he sat with them until 2 in the morning, and what he found there did not let him sleep at all. The steward, Vesey, had been robbing him for 6 years. It was not subtle, it was not even clever. It was the plain, patient theft of a man who had understood that the master was never at home and never would be. Timber sold and not entered, cottage rents collected twice, coal charged at 4 times its price and delivered at half its weight, so that the servants' hall at Inchwood had gone cold in December while the Duke of Inchwood was in Vienna, in a warm room, arguing about his brother's debts. And then, in January, in the middle of a column of Vesey's neat lies, the hand changed. It changed to a clear, upright, unfashionable hand that had plainly been taught by somebody who cared, and it went back 4 years, and it caught him, Vesey, on a single line about the price of lime, and beside it, in the margin, in that same hand, was written, "This is not possible." See the cordon bill and cross-refer to the timber, which is worse. She had gone through 6 years of ledgers, alone, in January, in a house where she's not yet mistress, and where she might have been turned out at a word from a man in Austria who had not troubled to answer a single letter. He turned the pages. She had found £1,100. She had turned Vesey off, a man twice her size, who had been at Inchwood since before she was born, and who had, according to a note in Mrs. Merridew's crabbed writing, spoke very rough to her in the yard, "Your Grace." She stood there and let him, and when he had done she told him he might have his character or his liberty and not both, and he took the character and went. And then at the back of the ledger, in a separate account in her hand, a list: Coles, Servants' Hall, blankets 6. Physician for Thomas, 3 visits, and a 4th marked paid privately, and the sum was not entered in the estate account at all, and Rafe sat in his chair with the blood going out of his face. He rang the bell at 2:30 in the morning, and Mrs. Merridew came dressed, because she had not been to bed either. Tom was ill, he said. In February, Your Grace. How ill? The old woman's mouth worked once. 8 days, she said. The fever went up on the 3rd night, and Dr. Prue said we must be prepared, and Miss Cordelia sat with him. Not in a chair, Your Grace. She would not have a chair. She lay on the boards beside the cot with her hand through the rails, so that if he woke in the dark he should find a hand there. And she did that for 8 nights, and on the 9th the fever broke, and she went out into the passage and was sick, and then she washed her face and went in to Hetty and read to her about elephants. Rafe Arden put down his pen very carefully. And she paid the physician, he said, out of her own money. She had no money, Your Grace. Then how? She sold her mother's ring, said Mrs. Merridew. The fire cracked. The clock in the hall struck the half-hour and went on ticking as clocks do, entirely without shame. Why, said Rafe, and his voice was not his own, was I not written to? You were written to, said Mrs. Merridew. I wrote in February. She wrote in February, 3 sheets, Your Grace, and she was that particular about it that she copied it fair twice, because her hand shook. And I wrote again in March, and she never wrote at all after February, and I have not liked to ask her why. He knew why. The letters were in his portmanteau, 4 of them. Unopened, because he had been busy, and because a man who has decided to be a stranger in his own house makes very sure not to read anything that might make him one no longer. He sat there, the Duke of Inchwood, in a cold library at 3 in the morning, with 1,100 stolen pounds and a sold ring and 8 nights on a nursery floor lying on the desk in front of him in a clear, upright, unfashionable hand. Mrs. Merridew, he said at last. My grandmother. Your Grace. She did this. All of it. The choosing of her, the sending of her here in the spring, the everything. Her Grace, said Mrs. Merridew, was a very great meddler, and she loved you, and she knew that you would never in 1,000 years choose anything for yourself but duty, because your father was the same and he died of it. She paused at the door. She said to me before she went, Merridew, he will not see her. He will look straight through her and go abroad. And I said, and what then, my lady? And she said, then the house will see her. And when he comes home the house will be a different house, and he will stand in the hall and not know it, and that will be the beginning of him. She curtsied and left him. And Rafe Arden sat until the sky went grey over Inchwood, in a hall that had a fire in it, and understood that he had been beaten, comprehensively, from beyond the grave by an old woman with a hand like a dropped fence. He was clumsy about it. He was clumsy for a fortnight, and every hour of it was his own fault. He did not know how to speak to her. He had been trained from birth in a manner that was proof against everything except a woman who sat on tables, and he found that his voice came out cold when he did not mean it to, and that when he tried to be kind he sounded as though he were awarding a pension. He told her that the £1,100 would be restored to her, and she said she had never taken a penny of it and did not want a farthing, and left the room. He told her that he would buy back her mother's ring, and she said, You will not, in a tone that shut the subject like a door, and went out into the garden and dug something up with unnecessary violence. He told her, and this was the worst, that she need have no fear about the settlements, that his word was given, that he was a man of honour and would of course fulfil the contract. Cordelia Marsh stood in the middle of the yellow drawing-room and looked at him. The contract, she said. It was my grandmother's wish. It was your grandmother's wish, she repeated, and you are a man of honor. And so you will marry me, as one settles a debt, and I am to be grateful, and we shall be very comfortable, and you will go to Vienna. That is not. Your Grace, said Cordelia, and her voice cracked straight across the middle of it. I have been in your house for 10 weeks, and I have loved every soul in it, and I did not do one single thing here for a contract. I did it because Tom was on fire and there was nobody else, and because Hetty had not been kissed goodnight in 4 years, and because your cook was buying bad coal with your money and weeping about it in the scullery. I would have done it if you had never come home. I would have done it if you had written to tell me you had married an Austrian. She was blazing. She was also, he saw with horror, crying, do not marry me out of honor. I would rather be turned out into the road at this moment with what I stand up in. And I mean that literally, Your Grace, and you may ring the bell and see whether I do not. She walked out. Rafe stood alone among the yellow chairs with his hands at his sides. He had faced down a Prussian minister and 4 of his brother's creditors and a mob at Ostend. He had never once, in 34 years, been so completely and so justly demolished. He went and found Hetty in the orchard, because there was nobody else in the world he could ask, and because a man will humble himself before a child sooner than before a woman, which is the last cowardice of the proud. Hetty. She was in the crook of the apple tree, and she looked down at him warily, as she had looked at him for 4 years. Is she going away? Said Hetty. That will depend, said Rafe, on whether I can persuade her to stay. And I do not know how, and I am told that you know her better than anybody in this house. His niece considered him for a long, cold, level moment, and he saw his brother in her face and his grandmother, and unmistakably himself. You could try telling her the truth, said Hetty. I have told her that I am a man of honor. That isn't the truth, said Hetty. That is what you say instead. And she went back to her apples, and left the Duke of Inchwood standing under a tree in his own orchard, holding his hat, in the middle of the afternoon, entirely undone. He tried, that week, to be of use, and discovered that his own household had quietly gone over to the other side. It was not insolence. Nobody at Inchwood would have dreamed of insolence. It was something far more terrible. They had simply, in 10 weeks, learned a new way of living, and they were all of them, from Mrs. Merry down to the boy who did the boots, braced against the day when the master should take it away again. He found it out in the servants' hall on the Monday, having gone down there for the first time in his life, and having very nearly turned back twice on the stairs. The talk stopped when he opened the door. 14 people stood up, somebody's chair wavered backwards. Sit down, said Rafe. Nobody sat down. I am told, he said, that the coal last winter was bad, a silence of such density that he could hear the kettle. It was that, Your Grace, said Cook at last, folding her arms, and something in the set her jaw told him she had been waiting 10 weeks to say it, and had made up her mind to be dismissed for it. Slate and dust and the sweepings of the yard, at 4 times its price, and I burned 300 weight of it in December to boil a pudding, and it would not come to the boil, and my girls had chilblains to the bone, and I said nothing, because who is there to say it to? Her chin came up. And then Miss Cordelia come down here in January, and she stood where you are standing, Your Grace, and she took up a lump of it, and she looked at it, and she said, Mrs. Ayres, is this what you have been given to cook my dinner with? And I said it was. And she said, then I shall not be eating dinner until it is mended, and she did not. 3 days, Your Grace. She lived on bread and had the fires kept up in this hall, and on the 4th day Vesey was gone. Rafe stood in the doorway of his own servants' hall, in a house 600 years old, and heard the whole indictment of his life delivered by a cook with her arms folded. Mrs. Ayres, he said, how long have you been in this house? 19 years, Your Grace. And in 19 years, said Rafe, has any master of it ever once come down these stairs to ask you a question? Mrs. Ayres opened her mouth and shut it. No, said the Duke of Inchwood, I thought not. I have ordered 30 ton of coal from Cordon, and I have ordered it in my own name, and the bill will come to me and I shall read it. And I would be obliged, Mrs. Ayres, if you would tell me anything else that is wrong in this house, anything at all, and I will hear it standing here, and I will not turn a single one of you off for saying it. The kettle went on boiling. And a girl at the back, a scullery maid of about 15, scarlet to the ears, with her hands twisted in her apron, said in a whisper that carried the length of the room, the nursery chimney smokes, Your Grace. It has smoked since Christmas. Miss Cordelia has been opening the window at night, and she sits in the cold with it open so Master Tom can breathe, and she will not have it mentioned to anybody, because she says the sweep would cost, and she has not the ordering of your money. Rafe went up. He went up alone, and it was the first time in 4 years that he had crossed that passage without a purpose behind him and a footman in front, and he stood in the doorway of the nursery in the late afternoon and looked at it properly. It was clean. It was warm, with the fire drawing badly and the window up 2 inches, exactly as the girl had said. There was a rag rug on the boards beside Tom's cot that had not been there in November, and it was flattened along one side, and Rafe stood looking at that flattened strip of rug for a long time. Because a man may hear a thing said and not believe it until he sees the shape a body has worn into the floor over 8 nights. Beside the cot, on a stool, was a nightlight, and a cup and a book, and a piece of paper folded small. He should not have looked at it. He looked at it. It was a list in that clear, upright, unfashionable hand, and it said things Tom asks for that I cannot give his mother, his uncle, that the sea should not exist, and do nothing for the first. I have promised him the second, which was wrong of me, and I shall have to answer for it. Perhaps we can manage the third between us with elephants. Rafe Arden sat down on the nursery floor, in his coat, beside the flattened rug with the paper in his hand, and he stayed there until the light went. And a housemaid coming up with candles at 7 o'clock found the Duke of Inchwood sitting on the boards with his back against the cot and his head bowed, and had the very great good sense to go away again and tell nobody. His cousin Ormerod came on the Thursday in a new curricle with a lawyer. He came as he had been coming for 4 years about the wards. There was money in the wards, a small trust from their mother's people, administered by whoever had charge of them, and Ormerod had discovered, in the second winter, that a bachelor duke who was never at home might be persuaded, by a sufficiently sympathetic relation, that 2 motherless children would be better off in a proper household with a proper mistress in it, and that the trust might follow them there. Rafe had refused him. Rafe had refused him coldly and correctly, and at a distance 4 times. But he had been in Vienna in February. I called, said Ormerod over the sherry, in the tone of a man laying down a card he has been holding all evening. In February. I came in the snow as a kindness, and I found the house in a shocking state and a strange young woman in the nursery, and a boy raving with fever, and no master within 900 miles. I was quite prepared to take them both away that night, for their own good, and my lawyer had the papers. Rafe set down his glass, and, said Ormerod, and his mouth went sour, she would not open the door. I beg your pardon? She came out onto the step, said Ormerod, with the boy's fever on her and no more than a shawl, and she stood in front of the door in the snow. And she said that no child left this house without his guardian's hand on the paper, and that his guardian was in Austria, and that I might therefore go to Austria. He tugged at his cravat. I told her she was a nobody. I told her she had no standing whatever. She said, and I shall remember it, Arden, I promise you, she said, I have no standing, sir, and no money and no name and nothing at all to lose, and I am between you and that door. You will find that a formidable combination. The clock ticked in the library at Inchwood. And I stood there, said Ormerod, in the snow for a quarter of an hour, arguing with a governess, and she did not move, and my lawyer got cold, and in the end I went away. He drained his sherry. She has no manners at all. I should turn her off if I were you. Rafe Arden rose. Ormerod, he said, get out of my house. Now, look here. You came in the snow, when a boy of 7 was dying, said the Duke of Inchwood, to take him away for his money, and a woman with nothing in the world stood in a doorway in a shawl and stopped you. And you have sat at my table and told me so as though it were an amusing anecdote. He walked to the bell and pulled it. I have been a very bad guardian and a worse master and an entirely absent man, and I have not one word to say in my own defence, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making it good. You I never wish to see again. My carriage will take you to the crossroads, and you may explain your cravat to the coachman. He found her in the herb garden at 6 in the evening. She had her sleeves turned back and her hands in the earth, and she did not look up when his shadow fell across the bed. Miss Marsh, said Rafe, I am going to tell you the truth, and I am extremely bad at it, and I would take it as a great kindness if you would go on digging, because I do not think I can say it to your face. Her hands went still, but she did not look up. My grandmother wrote to me that you had no money, no connections, and no beauty, and that I should not like you, he said. She was lying about 2 of those, and she knew it, and she was a wicked old woman, and I miss her every day. I signed the settlements because I was grieving and because I meant to break them, and I went abroad because Vienna was easier than Inchwood, and Inchwood was easier than the nursery, and the nursery. He stopped. The nursery was the only room in England I could not walk into, because my brother's children were in it, and they had a look of him, and I did not know how to be anything to them but a signature on a paper. So I was a signature on a paper. For 4 years. The blackbirds went on in the hedge. I had 4 of your letters in my portmanteau, said Rafe, unopened. I opened them last night. Every one. His voice went, and he took hold it again. The 3rd is dated the 11th of February. You had been 8 nights on the floor of that room. You had sold your mother's ring. And what you wrote to me, what you took the trouble to write to a man who had never once answered you, was that I was not to distress myself, that the fever had broken, that Tom had asked for me and you had told him I was coming, and that you hoped I would forgive the presumption. But you had thought it better than the truth. Cordelia Marsh sat back on her heels in the earth and put her hands over her face. You told a dying boy that I was coming, said Rafe, and I was not coming, and you knew I was not coming, and you told him anyway. And you have never once thrown it in my face, and you would not have thrown it in my face if I had lived here another 40 years. He knelt down in the herb bed in his coat. I am not asking you to marry me for the contract. Tear the contract up. I will have Pethick draw a deed tomorrow settling 400 a year on you whatever you answer, and you may go where you please and I shall not follow you, and you may swear at me in every letter you write and I shall read all of them twice. Rafe. I have not finished, he said, and if I stop now I shall never begin again. She lowered her hands. Her face was streaked with earth and tears, and she was, at that moment, in the low gold light of a May evening, the only thing he had ever wanted in his life. I stood in my hall in May, said the Duke of Inchwood, and there was a fire in it, and flowers in the dairy jug, and a ribbon on my grandfather's newel post, and my brother's boy was laughing on the landing, and I did not know the house. And I have thought since that a man may hold a title for 600 years, and never once own the place he lives in, and that you have owned it since March, and every soul in it, and that I would rather be a lodger in your house than the master of my father's. He held out his hand, earth-stained. In the herb bed. Do not marry me for honor. I have very little and I have spent most of it. Marry me because Tuesday is Latin, and because I should like to be told about the elephants, and because I have been cold for 4 years and I came home and found my own house warm, and it was you, Cordelia. It was you the whole time, and I am asking not as a duke. I have no right to ask you as a duke. I am asking as a man who has been extremely stupid and would like very much to be forgiven and to stay. Cordelia Marsh looked at his hand for a long moment, then she put her filthy one into it. You are 2 months late, she said unsteadily. I am 4 years late, yes, she said. You are. And she gripped his hand hard enough to hurt. Do not be late again. And Rafe Arden bent his head over her earth-stained knuckles, there among the rosemary and the thyme, with the blackbirds shouting in the hedge. And behind them, from an upper window, there came a shriek of purely unbearable delight, followed by the sound of 2 people falling off a window seat, and one of them being loudly blamed for it. They were married in June in the small church at Inchwood, with the doors open. Mrs. Merridew wept from the first word to the last and denied it afterwards with a ferocity that nobody was brave enough to challenge. Hetty walked in front with the ring, in a fury of concentration, and did not drop it. Tom, who was 7 and had lately discovered his own importance, was permitted to carry nothing at all, carried the whole occasion regardless, and was found afterwards asleep under the vestry table with a piece of ginger cake in each hand. There was a fire in the great hall that night, and there was a fire in it every night thereafter, and the newel post at Inchwood had a length of blue ribbon knotted round it for the next 30 years, because the Duke of Inchwood would not have it taken off, and grew in time rather short with anybody who suggested it. He never went to Vienna again. He went, instead, into the schoolroom on Tuesdays, and sat at the back on a chair much too small for him, and was corrected on his ablatives by his own wife in front of 2 extremely delighted children, and bore it, the whole county was later given to understand, with a patience that nobody who'd known him before the age of 34 would have believed possible. And sometimes in the evening, when the house was quiet and the ribbon counting was done and the ginger cake had been fairly divided, Rafe Arden would stand in the door of the old schoolroom and look at the woman sitting cross-legged on the deal table with chalk along her jaw, and would think of an old, wicked, dying woman writing in her hand like a dropped fence. "One day you will understand that I have done you the greatest kindness of your life. You are staring," his wife would say, without looking up. "I am," said the Duke of Inchwood. "At what?" "At my house," he said. "I have only had it since March."